Recognize this?
Oh, that looks like a
playbill.
A playbill from a play.
Yeah.
That somebody wrote, adapted from your book.
I hope we have time for you to ask me about, so what's with all these titles, Denny? Can't you make up your mind?
Yes. Yeah. I will definitely ask that. Especially since I know one of the answers. Why is this called Bloodlands?
Right.
Well, welcome everyone. We are going to get to all of those questions in just a few minutes. I want to thank you all for spending a little bit of your Thursday evening with us. My name is Pat Kowitzel. I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books, and I am so thrilled to be with all of you tonight, joining us, I think, from all around the country. We have over 100 people already logged in our Zoom tonight. We have more joining us on Facebook. If you have questions at any point tonight, please do post those in the Q&A if you're here on Zoom. If you happen to be joining us from Facebook, you can put those in the chat. We'll be checking over there as well. And so we will get to as many questions as time allows. We'll also be posting links to purchase copies of the Deaths of Sybil Bolton from Magic City Books in the chat as well. And it's available there in the program information on Facebook. If you are not wanting to break away from the action at any time, you can go to magiccitybooks.com. And after we're all done, and be able to purchase the book that way, as well as many of the books for our other upcoming virtual events. We do these just about 3 times a week. We have our schedule pretty well booked out through March at this point, but we also have dates locked in April and May. Virtual is certainly the way things are going to go, at least through that part of the year. And then we'll see kind of where we are this summer as far as whether or not there's going to be some possibilities if the vaccine is widespread, possibilities to gather outside or in a distance kind of way. And so continue to check back on that. We want to thank all of you for joining us. I know that we have a few folks that are with us tonight that may be here for the very first time. And so thank you. Magic City Books is a nonprofit bookstore located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. We do event programming. We've done over 100 of these virtual events now since last April. And when we get back to doing in-person events, we'll get back to doing that, and we'll have a robust schedule then as well. And every book that you purchase from Magic City Books helps go back in and fund our mission of bringing more authors and discussions about books to our audience. And so we really appreciate you purchasing your book from Magic City Books. We have a lot of great events that are coming up, including 3 terrific ones next week, Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. Monday, Ben Montgomery, a native Oklahoman and now a journalist based in Florida, has written a book called A Shot in the Moonlight about a freed slave and a Confederate soldier teaming up in the years after the war. Ben's reporting actually was the basis of The Nickel Boys, the Pulitzer Prize winning book by Colson Whitehead. And so Ben interviewed Colson at an earlier Magic City Books virtual event last summer. That's available on our YouTube channel, along with all of our other virtual events. And so take a look at those at some point and join us Monday for that event. Tuesday night, we're going to be joined by Brandon Hobson. His new book, his new novel, The Removed, is coming out on Tuesday. He's going to be in conversation with Rilla Askew, the wonderful Oklahoma novelist and essayist. And they're going to be talking about Brandon's new book. Brandon also has moderated a few of our virtual events in the past, including one with Kelly Jo Ford for Crooked Hallelujah and Tony Jensen for a memoir called Carrie. Both of those happened last summer and early fall. And then Thursday night, we are going to be joined by Tim Wise. And if that name is not familiar to you, then maybe you weren't on a college campus in the last 25 years. Tim travels the country all the time and has spoken on thousands of college campuses and in high schools about race. And his newest book is called Dispatches from the Race War. Tim is going to be in conversation with Phil Armstrong, who is the project coordinator of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Commission. And so we're really looking forward to that event. So 3 great ones next week. Like I said, we record these events and put them on our YouTube channel. So please check that out as well. Just search Magic City Books on YouTube and you'll be able to find all our past events. Tonight, we are really proud to welcome Denny McAuliffe and for a conversation about his book, The Deaths of Sybil Bolton. This is a book that was first published 25 years ago and had a little run and was kind of a known thing. And then, as some books do, it just kind of, wasn't around anymore. We came out of print and hard to get. And then some renewed interest came from the David Grann book, Killers of the Flower Moon. Now, there were a lot of people that were interested in this, in Denny's book throughout this entire time. And sometimes interest doesn't necessarily keep a book from being going into out of print, but it had, and luckily for all of us, Chicago Review Press has put out a brand new edition of the book, including an introduction from David Grann. So tonight we're going to be discussing the book and talking to the author, as well as our moderator for this evening, David Blakely, who adapted Deaths of Sybil Bolton for the stage back in the summer of 2019, a time that seems like it's the near past, but boy, it feels like it's a million years ago, doesn't it? So this is really one of our favorite kinds of author programs, because David and Denny have worked together and known each other for a long time. They're good friends, and we get to be sort of flies on the wall to hear a conversation between these two. They know this work inside and out, and so we all get to benefit from that. So I want to give a warm Magic City Books welcome to David Blakely and Denny McAuliffe. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, and have a great night.
Well, thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
And thank
Pat.
you, Magic City Books, for having me.
Oh, and he's gone.
Sure
He's
is.
just,
Instantly.
he is just MCB. Okay, so Dennis McAuliffe Jr., we're going to call you Denny from now on. Is that okay?
Please, only my mother called me Dennis, and that was right before the hammer came down. So
Oh, yes.
if you call me Dennis, I'll look around and duck.
Well, I always knew I was in trouble when my mother would say to me, David, with a T at the end of my name. So, and we're going to be talking about your book, which general subject is the Osage Reign of Terror. But we're going to enter it sort of in a different way, the way you sort of entered it. So I'm just going to ask you some questions, if that's okay, and we'll have a conversation.
I actually have a short intro to the Osage Reign of Terror in case anyone needs it, although I doubt that they do.
What do you want to do?
If they're
Do you have
listening.
it?
So,
yeah.
So the idea for that was looking at the playbill of The Deaths of Sybil Bolton, a play by David Blakely. And on the cover are two newspaper articles. And the newspaper articles basically said, they're both stories from January of 1926. And they said, a federal investigation reveals a reign of terror against Osage Indians that will astound the nation when the details are known. And those details are still astounding the nation 95 years later. Yeah. And there's a reason for that. It's still a shock to hear the details of the depth of the blatant and undisguised racism behind what happened. You know, it's one thing, and the callous and cold indifference to human life and the systematic and slow slaughter of their victims. So it's one thing to ride in and wipe out a village in one big burst of violence, but it's quite another to wipe out that village slowly by marrying into families and to kill them off one by one, people who you profess to love and who love you. And that's what's so horrifying about the Reign of Terror. And that's why those details still continue to astonish the nation.
Yes, absolutely. I will add that one of the things that I think is so interesting about it is that the information that we know is horrendous. The information and the facts that we don't know because they've been completely destroyed and obliterated, except through perhaps some oral tradition, are astounding.
Right.
David Grann says in his book, at the very end of it, when he talks about your book, that the FBI came in and they figured that there was somewhere around 60 some cases, 67 cases, I think. But you talk about all these different things, different people who died that were never investigated.
Right.
Hundreds of them.
Right. And I'll actually talk about that,
Okay.
about the hundreds, and what the numbers might be, but at some point.
Okay. Well, let's start with, how did you get started with this? What?
Those of you who don't know the story, my mother was told her whole life since she was a child that her mother died of kidney disease. That's how, when she was a baby. And that's how we were told, so my grandmother was really my step grandmother. It's one of these complicated, family stories. So in 1992, my sister was on vacation in Kansas, Alta Vista, Kansas, and ran into a 90-year-old barber this is the town where my grandfather, Harry Bolton, was from. And in the course of that, so the barber was best friends with my grandfather. And in the course of talking to my sister, hey, how's it going? What happened to so-and-so? How's your mother? And then she says, oh, wait, was your grandmother Harry's second wife, or that Indian who committed suicide? And
Yes.
Boom, that got our attention. So something I've always wondered about. So my mother was 67 years old at the time. So if you listeners found out that information, that your grandmother had committed suicide, would you, and your mother didn't know, and had been raised with this whole different story, would you have told her? And I still wrestle with that. I'm still not sure I would have told my mother. I would have looked into it. So how did this story start? So my mother then told me, it's the Denny, sit down. I've got something important to tell you. Whenever I heard that, it was something important. And she told me the story, and I said, I'll look into it. Okay. And look into it. I'd get the death certificate. So I a couple of days later, I called to get the death certificate, and I said, oh, wait a minute, there's something I forgot to ask my mother. And I called my mother and I said, what was her name? I didn't even know her name. She said, Sybil Frances Bolton.
And you were in your 40s at the time.
Yes, I was.
And did not know your grandmother's name.
Right. My grandmother didn't exist. I had never seen her. She died when my mother was 16 months old. So then I got the death certificate. I called the mortician in Pawhuska. Oh, and I also said, so Mom, where, what was her name and where did it happen? Pawhuska, Oklahoma. And I said, you were in Pawhuska? Because we did know the story that my mother was alone with her mother when she died of kidney disease. And so I was shocked to hear that my mother was on the Osage Reservation. I always thought she was from Kansas City, and then she lived in Oklahoma City, and so on and so forth. So that's what started it. I just started every phone call I made. So I talked to the mortician, and he said, so I said, could you give me cause of death? So of course, when I called, to get the death certificate, that was mailed to me. So the news about the suicide was talking to the mortician, and he got into the records of old Mr. Johnson, the Johnson's funeral home, long dead. And you could hear him turn the pages, and he said, yeah, there's a record here for Sybil Bolton. And he gave the date of death, and I said, so, does it give cause of death? And he said, yes. gunshot wound suicide.
Hmm.
And it was, so this is how the story started.
So the family history, which you didn't necessarily pay much attention to it because it wasn't
Of
that
course.
interesting,
Right.
right?
I didn't even pay any attention to being Osage either.
Right. You
And that's
didn't,
part
did
of
you
it.
even know you were Osage until you were like 15 in
Yes.
teenager?
So my mother became very ill one night when I was 15, and thought this was it. So she had to set the record straight before she died. And she was just, had food poisoning. But I'll never forget, she was crying and said, "Denny, I'm so sorry. You're an Osage Indian. Your grandmother is not what the person you think is your grandmother is not your real mother, your real grandmother. Your grandmother was Osage. I'm so sorry." And it still upsets me when I think of that, because what I realized later as this story progressed, that what I was seeing was the effects of her white father, my grandfather, Harry Bolton, trying to suppress from her the fact that she was Osage. And so, because of that situation and the way it was presented to me, I realized, oh, this is bad news. I'm not going there anymore. And so I totally never asked another word about it. Didn't have anything to do with it.
Okay. So you dug into the archives. You started to look at it not through stories exactly, but through documents. What did you find?
Well, so I got so when I heard about this, I don't know, I had this funny reaction that it just sounded suspicious. It just didn't sound right, and I also got Johnson's Funeral Home mailed me a copy of the funeral record. And there were some things written on there in different handwritings that just raised my suspicions. The words suicide and gunshot wound were written in different handwriting. There were some other things that were questionable. It just got me suspicious. So I said, you know what? If Sybil didn't die of kidney disease, and if she didn't commit suicide, which just in case she didn't commit suicide, there was only one other way she could have died. She would have been murdered. And then I got to thinking that, well, who's the obvious suspect for murdering her? Obviously, it was my grandfather, who I couldn't get along with. So I told my wife, you know what? I'm going to prove my, grandfather killed my grandmother. She said, go for it. I think she really just wanted me to change the subject. So I started looking into it. So the first thing I did was I walked to the bookcase and I opened John Joseph Matthews' book, The Osages, which I had on my bookshelf, which I had never opened. And I opened to her inscription. She'd given it to me for a gift years and years ago. Before, I'd always kept it on my bookcase, and it said, to Denny, this is in hopes that you may learn something about your mother's Osage heritage, which I realized was that's something that she lost when she lost her mother. So then I started researching. I started going to libraries. I started, there was no Google, there was no YouTube. In fact, I recently reread the book and I said,
were this big?
Right, and it's stuck in the car. There were car phones. They were called car phones in those days. So I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. I was living in Baltimore. I went to the Johns Hopkins University Library. I went here and there, and within 2 months, I ended up, and so I started reading some causes of death, little snippets of history books here and there, that there was a killing spree against Osages in the early 1920s. Now, my grandmother died in 1925, November 7th, 1925. So there was a little bit, at that time, they were considered the richest people per capita in the world because of their oil. And so, with each step along the way, this is getting more and more interesting. So I finally, I interviewed some people. There was a professor from Berkeley who had written a history of the Osages called The Underground Reservation, Terry Wilson. I interviewed him. I was doing all these things that a reporter does, doing my reporting, we call it. I was gathering string. Yep. And so eventually I wound up then I found out that the FBI conducted an undercover investigation during these years. So I found out that the FBI, the records of the FBI investigation were at the FBI. Ironically, not just a couple of blocks from where I worked. I worked then and now still at the Washington Post. So one day I went over there, and there I find the 3,274 page file of the FBI records. It was about this big, about 3 feet wide.
Good Lord. And that had in it all of the information about the Reign of Terror?
That had in it the files of the FBI investigation of the Reign of Terror, yes.
And that is the basis of one part of your book and a large part of David Grann's book, right?
Yes, yes.
So,
yes.
Why didn't you write Killers of the Flower Moon?
I'm glad you asked that question because I've actually been asking myself that for 25 years, 20 years before David Grann wrote Killers of the Flower Moon. So if there are any writers out there, any journalists or historians, students, whatever, so you come upon this great find, in for a journalist, this is the journalist's dream. Yeah. This is a scoop, something that's never been written about before. There had never been any book written based on the FBI files. And I'm leafing through it. Now, keep in mind, I'm leafing through it looking for traces of Sybil Bolton.
Right.
But as I'm leafing through it, I'm saying, this could be my book. This is my book. So at that point, I realized I'm going to write a book about this. So the question is, what kind of book do you write? Okay, so you've got all this stuff. And the obvious thing is you write a history. You write, in effect, what David Grann wrote 25 years later. So Grann's book was the FBI files and the grand jury records and the court records. And then he also got the records from the main FBI. Is Tom Wright? Is that his name?
Tom White.
Oh, White.
You're talking about the investigator.
Oh, right.
No.
Right. Okay. Tom White.
That's right. Not that I'm correcting you about your
there are
book.
a couple of Wrights in there, and also two Whites.
Two Whites.
Tom
yes.
Whites, yeah.
There's a fellow who comes from the FBI and a fellow who actually comes up from Tulsa.
Right.
Philip.
Right.
So,
right.
Both named.
So anyway, so you're looking at. So I'm looking at this thing. So the first instinct is to write a story about the FBI files based on about the FBI murder investigation and the Reign of Terror based on this. Okay. But as this is 3,000 pages. It took months to read. I got copies of it. I brought it home. I went to it's called the FOIA reading room several times. So going through there, and I decided and don't laugh, or you should laugh,
I will.
but I didn't think at that time that anyone would be interested in reading a dreary history of yet another Indian massacre. Okay. Now, 20 years later, this was the Washington Post guy decided, no, this wouldn't be the best story, the best way to write it. 20 years later, the New Yorker guy schooled the Washington Post guy, wrote The Killers of the Flower Moon, and boom. However, I will say, and my wife actually agrees with me on that, if he had written this, timing is everything. If he had written this book 20 years ago, 25 years ago, would it have done as well?
No.
You never know. Totally different time and mindset. But I'll tell you something that I also, the more I read the FBI files, the thinner they seem to get. In other words, the reason I say that is, one, I was still looking for Sybil. I was still trying to figure out who murdered my grandmother, because I was actually very convinced at this point that she was murdered. There were some links, without going into those details, there were some links in the FBI files to, her family. Her guardian, for example, is mentioned in those FBI files. And the other thing was, there weren't any Osages in these FBI files. There were dead Osages in the FBI files.
Right.
There weren't any, the Osages were not the source. The Osages were funding this. The Osages paid the FBI to come and investigate these murders. If they hadn't paid $20,000 to the FBI to do it, there would have been no Reign of Terror investigatory files. So the Osages that were there were dead. Okay, and I was interested in, one, who killed Sybil Bolton, and two, writing a story from the Osage point of view. So that left me with two other options. One of the reasons, when I went finally to Pawhuska and spent a couple of months there, one of the things I was looking for was a way to tell this story from a historical story set in those times, told from the Osage point of view. Couldn't find it. Couldn't find any trace of Sybil. And as my book progresses, my frustrations over that progress. She was erased. Okay. There was no Osage News at that time, the Osage tribal newspaper. Osages were not writing these stories. The FBI files were written by white FBI agents who interviewed mostly white sources, white bad guys hanging around Osage County. So I was unable, one of the ideas I had was maybe I could sort of try to do a biography of Sybil and tell the story that way. Or, in other words, use her as a main character, but there wasn't enough information about her.
Right.
And then another thing was, well, how about historical fiction? I could just write a novel. I had all this material. With each passing day, I was becoming more and more of an expert on this. Okay, I had read just tons of stuff. And a couple of people have tried historical fiction. Charles Redcorn in his excellent Pipe for February.
Yeah.
Linda Hogan, and this is a couple of years before my book called Mean Spirit. It was actually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, but none of it, well, so the problem is, one of the powers of those FBI records was the gruesome detail. The detail was in there. And also the way people talked and what they said and how they confessed and all of this stuff. So if you wrote a novel, you'd lose that. You'd lose the impact of the fact that this really happened and these people really existed.
So you actually thought about fictionalizing it,
Yes.
making everything,
Yes.
using fictional names, etc., like that, and you
Yes.
decided because of that, because of what you saw there, to make it more of a true crime kind of thing. But it isn't just that.
Yes. One of the things, I don't know if anybody has seen Schindler's List, Nazi,
I see.
Steven Spielberg.
Yes.
And if you read the book is actually nonfiction, but there's some there's some conversations. Okay, That's a way I could have done it, but he then called it a novel. He did not call this a work of nonfiction, a novel read like nonfiction. Boom. That's something I thought of doing. So again, going back to my belief that nobody would read just a history of. No one would read a history of yet another dreary massacre of Native Americans. I decided that what I wanted to do is recreate the excitement of the investigation as I was that my mother and I both experienced. I was sharing this with my mother. We'd have every other night, we'd have conversations. Mom, you wouldn't believe what I found. Mom, you wouldn't believe this. Can you believe this? This is what I found. So try to recreate this happened and then this, and then I discovered this, and oh my God, I discovered this, and look at that. So I decided that what I would do is write a whodunit. That's what I was mostly interested in, whodunit. Okay, and write this detective story, and the whodunit would be the lure that I would use to catch the reader and drag the reader through a part of the pond that he or she ordinarily wouldn't go through.
Yeah.
So thus I wrote the detective story, and that's how I ended up with this.
And you were sort of the detective.
I was the detective, and it did a couple of things. One. I was able to have voice, okay? Yeah. I say that as I'm losing mine. I was able to have voice. So a lot of people, like it or not, there's one thing you can say about the Deaths of Sybil Bolton, it has voice.
Oh, it is. Perhaps I need to just sort of say this. I had first contact with your book 12, 15 years ago. I read it. I sent you an email immediately saying I wanted to put it as a piece of theater, and you said go to it. You were in Montana.
I was in Montana. Actually, we talked.
Yeah, we did. And then about 4 years ago, I sent you another thing. Said I really like to into a play because it's such a great personal story. And it's told so incredibly well. You're such a good writer. And your response was, didn't you call me 10 years ago asking me to do this? I went, okay, yeah.
So, yes. So, but I didn't want to write that personal story. I wanted to place it back then. Okay. I didn't want to be in it. I'm a reporter. We don't get in the way of our stories. And suddenly this story is about me. In fact, when David Grann, at the first time I heard this book described as a memoir, and David Grann called it that, I went, what? Huh? It's not a memoir. In other words, I decided to set it up as a detective story and to recreate how the story unfolded. I tried to recreate that excitement, the things I learned, and one of the things it did, I was able to write it in what I call the reporter's notebook format. There's a whole section of, I think, notes from a detective sleuth, a library sleuth. I think that's what I called it. So basically, here's this interview. Here's this history. Here's this, other stuff, going back and forth. Back and forth. And the idea was I would tell Osage history as I was learning it and learning things about the Reign of Terror, learning things about Sybil.
Yeah.
And we would both meet in Pawhuska at the same time to tell the Reign of Terror story. So I used this reporter's notebook to tell the Osage story through some incredible things that a lot of people knew about. Remember, I was very sensitive to the fact that people would shy from the massacre story. So I was trying to get them interested in things they knew already about Indian people, one of which was Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, gosh,
Found
yes.
out that those big bad Indians in Little House on the Prairies walking around with skunks in their belt and scaring poor little Laura were Osages. Okay.
Yes.
And
I
another
love
one
the-
was Custer in the Battle of the Washita. So I told those stories. And then, you know, so in the telling, I get the Osages to Osage County as I then drove to Pawhuska and started, and then the Reign of Terror, the realization of that, and the explanation for how that all came about, that all happened at pretty much the same time.
And one of the ways that you did that, because I believe, I'm not giving anything away. Oh, in case you haven't read the book, this is a great sort of thing. There were only like 3 or 4 mentions of Sybil in public record.
Right.
Her birth, her marriage, her death, and that's basically
that's right. Mm-hmm.
Right. So most of this you got from oral tradition, from family members, from the people who
interviewing little old
it.
ladies who still
Right.
knew her.
And one of the things I think is, as a writer, one of the bravest things that I think you did, you start off on your journey to Pawhuska somewhere in the middle of the book,
Mm-hmm.
right? But before that, you give the book up. You stop writing the book, and you say,
Yes.
"Mom,
right,
you write the book,
you tell
and
the
you give her
story."
half a chapter."
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, I call that actually her chapter. So I asked her, so tell me every story that you knew that you remember hearing about Sybil. And by this time, we were also calling her Sybil,
Right.
not
What do
your
you call?
grandmother, because then there was, you know, the other grandmother and so on and so forth. So Sybil, tell me just write down everything you remember about Sybil. And I think that that's the best part of the book, personally. She was a writer.
Part of the book.
She was a writer. In fact, there's parts of that, the story she tells about meeting her grandmother, Sybil's mother, Kathleen Connor Woodward, and meeting her as a child. This is, of course, after Sybil had died, in a train car, and then watching the train leave, and she could hear as the train leaves, she could hear the tracks, the click clack going. Goodbye, Katie. Goodbye, Katie. Goodbye, Katie. Goodbye. I mean, that was just, oh my God. Even, you know, thinking about it now. So I read that part at her funeral.
Well,
it was just so good.
Yeah. Did you have
book readings? I didn't read, when I gave book readings, I didn't read what I wrote. I read what my mother wrote.
And did you have to clean that up a little bit?
No. So I tried. So she wrote it all out in longhand on long yellow legal paper with red pen. Okay. And so I transcribed it. I put it into the computer. And as I was going along, and I threw in this zinger and that zinger, and I threw in this phrase and that phrase. And my editor, when he read it, he says, you know, this is really good. But these things, and here I'm going to take them all out because it just doesn't sound like her. And he ended up taking out everything that I had put into it. So this really is her. This is her, untouched by her editor's son.
I don't know how much we should give away in terms of how it goes, but I do have a question about this because if I have this right, up until the age of early 40s, you're a white boy.
Yes, yes. So I still
Not just
am.
a white boy, but a pasty Irish white boy. I might add, I'm a pasty Irish white boy too.
Uh-huh.
And then you dig into your family history. You create this detective story, and in the course of doing that, you journey into the Osage culture.
Yes. Well,
The culture of the
yes.
Oklahomas in the 1920s.
Right.
So, how
So-
did you feel about that? Are you an expert? You
No.
became an expert.
Well, so one, I had the editor in me has to take out the words culture and apply history.
Okay.
So let me look. I have some notes here.
Oh, I thought
So
I'd
one of
surprise
the
you with that.
things, so one of the things that happened was that as the more I started investigating, the more I started looking into this, and the more I started reading, the more I started, this weird thing was happening where I was changing my ethnic identification. I started thinking about myself as an Osage, or it was more like, can I be an Osage? Could I be an Osage? Am I an Osage? And so
Yeah,
this
that's not an easy question.
it
to
isn't
answer.
easy, and it goes all through the book, and it's still it's still a big part of my life. So let me just backtrack on this. I became an expert on how to kill an Osage. Okay.
Oh,
I hate to say it, I said this in the book. I know more than I want to know about how Osages die and how Osages were murdered, but I hadn't found out yet how to live as an Osage. And I'll be honest with you, I wanted to try to see if I could live as an Osage, if I could be an Osage, if I was an Osage. Yes, I had a Osage membership card and a CDIB, and I did from as long as I can remember. But I never took it seriously. And suddenly here I am beginning to take this seriously. And I realized it was because this happened to my mother. Because my mother, actually, I found out, was narrowly survived the death of her mother, the murder of her mother. My mother was there. If it had happened, if I was looking into somebody a couple of generations ago, if I was looking into my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandfather, or as somebody from the archive said, Joe Indian on the Hill, who was somewhere in my family line, and I found out about this on ancestry.com, this would not have happened. But this happened to my mother. And I can't tell you how shocked I was to realize that probably the biggest thing in her life, and then by extension, what shaped her, and then by extension, one of the biggest forming things in my life was the fact that she was an Osage Indian, and she was almost murdered because she was an Osage Indian. So what did that make me? And then, as I did learn more about my Osage family, I found that being Osage was the foundation of their life. It was central to their identification. So, and that would have been Sybil as well. So if that hadn't happened, my mother would have been raised on the Osage reservation like Sybil was, and she would have also been important, being she also would have identified herself as an Osage. So why can't I? Why can't I and everyone whose family through murder, theft, kidnapped, my mother was also kidnapped in this story, was taken away from her Indian tribe, from Indian people and her Indian family. Why can't we have the right to put that train back on the tracks.
And,
And
you're
I
still asking,
decided I could. I'm still trying
yeah.
to learn how and if I can become an Osage.
So I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to a couple of things. One of them is titles. So
Oh, yes.
you wrote The Deaths of Sybil Bolton. When I read it, I'm going to show my rather dog-eared. Yeah, that's the original, right?
Yes, it was The Deaths of Sybil Bolton,
Right.
an American history.
And then it was turned into, and I have that one. Yes, mine
Bloodlands.
looks like hell compared to yours. But then I
I'd
tore this
already
thing
read
apart.
it.
Well,
And
yeah.
then this one. This is my favorite. So how come I can't make up my mind? Why do I keep changing these titles? Well, I will say that it is pretty amazing. This is a 25-year-old book that I say nobody's read, and it's got 3 titles now from 3 different publishers. So, that's not too shabby. So
Yeah. Well, let's not forget that when I wrote the first version of
you
this,
had another title.
I changed the name of it. Yes.
Right. Yet again. So the hardback did not immediately go into paperback. That took about 5 years. And the paperback publisher was Council Oak Books, and the publisher was Sally Dennison. And I was thrilled when she agreed to put the book out in paperback, because Council Oak Books did fabulous books. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, but before the book came out in 1999, it was sold to Sky Vodka.
Yes.
We haven't talked about the drinking in here, but there's some drinking in here.
What the irony of a book in which you openly proclaim your alcoholism is sold to a distillery.
Right. So, and this was the first book that they did under Sky Vodka, and they moved the publishing house to San Francisco. So the publisher of that, or the editor of that, decided that she wanted to change the title because she was afraid that readers would think Sybil was that Sally Fields character in a TV series called Sybil, about somebody with multiple personalities.
Right.
So this is so they originally proposed the Osage Bride murders. And I said, oh my God, you can't change it to that. That's terrible. So after a week of muttering, and I came up with Bloodland, which I really don't like the title. So
it does sound a little bit like a cocktail that you might make with vodka and tomato juice.
And Sky Vodka, right?
Sky Vodka.
So after you did the play, the one-act play under yet another title, Four Ways to Die.
4 Ways to Die.
Uh-huh.
Which comes directly out of your book.
Right. So you said, Danny, wouldn't it be great if they could, republish your book under the original title and with it forward by David Grann? In other words, you said a 25th anniversary edition. Wouldn't that be great? So I asked them, and I asked David Grann, and he and I have become friends, and he agreed to do it.
I don't know if everybody here knows this, but you met David Grann here in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
I did. I met him. But the first time I talked to him, and this is sad, 5 minutes after I found out my father died.
Oh, no.
In 2012, the phone rang, and it was David Grann saying, hey, I'm writing about the Osage Reign of Terror. Is there any time we can talk? And I said, David, this is a really bad time to talk. Can I call you back? And I told him that I just heard my father just died. And so we talked months later. And so we've talked since, and I introduced him to my cousin, who you also know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yes. So you got the Bloodland, and then you managed to get this book out there in a 25th anniversary thing. And here you are 25 years later, what kind of impact has I guess what I should probably say in 20 words or fewer, what's the impact that happened to you in the last 25 years?
Well, the main thing, I stopped drinking. That was a biggie. In fact, the date was May 13th, 1993. Today, just for kicks, I did a date calculation calendar, a date duration calculator. And I've been sober for 10,122 days. Almost 28 years. So I've almost been sober almost as long as I was drinking. So I started young. I found family that we never knew we had. And on the book tour for Sybil, someone introduced me to my cousin. I didn't know I had a cousin. We've become best friends.
Can I just say, can you show the original book cover? Because it has a picture of Sybil on it, and I'm just going to hold my copy.
Yes, this is a different one. Yeah,
this is a different picture.
So at the time of the original book, this was the only picture my mother had, and it was a picture that her father and stepmother did not throw away. They didn't know she had it. So it was actually just a little snapshot. There was actually, in the original, there's a little dog here. And they, for some reason, photoshopped it out. So after I met my cousin, Joe Connor, he introduced me to other family members, other Connors, one of whom had this portrait of Sybil.
And your mother.
And my mother, yes. And this is my mother. Okay. And one of the things I'm so happy about the new edition is that it shows this really cool curl here. It was covered up by Bloodlands. I mean, I predict this curl is coming back.
Excellent. One of you say that we know that you've said you work for the Washington Post now, and you worked for the Washington Post then.
In between. So the only way I realized that I could try to learn more about becoming Osage and being Native American was the same way I found out about it in the first place, and that was through journalism. So 5 years, so I got involved with the Native American Journalists Association and helping Native students through the NAJA, through their student conferences. And then in 1999, the University of Montana School of Journalism called and asked if I could come out for a year. And I said, oh, hold on a minute, I got to talk to my wife. So hung up, ran to the Atlas. They had atlases in those days, big books, to see where Montana was.
Oh, East Coaster, you.
It's way out there. So it took a leave of absence, a 1 year's leave of absence. Started, working with their Native students in the journalism school. And then I ended up staying there 11 years, and I created a Native journalism training and mentoring program nationwide. So students didn't have to be in Montana, using the internet as a school paper and training. If the one Native student in Oklahoma, for example, who wanted to become a journalist, I could reach out there and help them. And so there are actually a number of Native journalists still working today that went through the program that I was running, and another program with the Freedom Forum that I was helping out with, and stayed there 11 years. The financial crisis hit 2009, so my programs were all grant funded, and an even bigger event, the birth of twin grandchildren on the East Coast. My wife said, we're out of here. So the Washington Post was nice enough to hire me back for the world's worst job. I was the overnight editor running the WashingtonPost.com from 11 p.m. to 7 in the morning.
Yeah. Oh yeah, baby.
I did that a couple of years, and then so now I work for the opinion section.
Yes, you're editing the opinion section,
Yes,
which
some
I'm not
of
even
it.
going to get into because we've already talked about this, but what a wild ride that must have been these last months, year.
Yes,
Right.
no
So
comment.
so we have a couple of questions from people who
Yes.
are watching. And um, let's start with the first question. It's actually one of the questions that I had for you. What are the deaths of Sybil Bolton?
Okay. So it's not only all the lies that my mother was told and all the different, so she died of kidney disease. No, she died of suicide. And then all the different versions of that. Okay.
Yes.
There were different versions of her death, but they really stand for all of those hundreds and hundreds of Osages who the FBI did not investigate. Okay, so the FBI basically spent 2.5 years investigating, solving the murders of 3 Osages and 2 whites. Okay. Right. And these were murders everybody knew about who did it in the first place. Okay. Right. But there were, so the FBI records said there were 24 murders, and then other sources said anywhere from 45 to 60, which actually represents 1 to 3% of the tribe, which would translate to a murder rate of 1,500 to 3,000 per 100,000. The U.S. murder rate right now is 5 per 100,000. And the let's see, so from 1906 to the 1920s, the Osage population dropped 6%. And this was at a time in our history where even African-American population was going up. So all indications showed that there were literally hundreds and hundreds. So now what's happened with my book, when my book came out, Osages were still not talking about it. So one of the things my book forced them, for some of the elders against their best wishes, forced them to start talking about this. And now then, of course, David Grann's book came out. And now Osages are openly telling family stories.
Yeah.
And so now it's really pointing to the hundreds and hundreds. So Osage filmmaker Ryan Redcorn has told me that, to quote him, you can throw a stone in Osage County. You can't throw a stone in Osage County without hitting somebody who was affected by the Reign of Terror.
Yeah.
I think everybody was.
Yeah. There's a couple other questions here. One of them I know has to do with what's to be done historically with this whole incident, right? We have people that we have documented that had oil rights who were murdered for their oil rights, and those oil rights turned over to people probably murdered them. And then they made buku tons of money from that. They're not the only ones outside the Osage Nation that has that. I know the Catholic Church has some,
yes,
and a couple
tons.
other things as well. So what do you do
Greta
about that?
Garbo ended up with a head right.
Well,
So what? Yeah, what do you do about it?
Yeah,
I think that you have to first find out what happened. Who did what? To do more, who got what, and then it's just some form of reconciliation. But the first thing you have to do is to openly talk about it. And I understand in Osage County, it's still a very difficult thing to talk about it. The Osages are talking about it. The non-Osages are not. They don't want to hear it. When my book came out, I was banned by the Osage County Historical Society. They wouldn't sell my book. And even, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, suddenly it was making the rounds and people were horrified by all these awful things that I was saying about upstanding citizens of Osage County. I didn't say them. the FBI records said them.
Right.
So there has to be more research, and there has to be more writing.
Well, when I talked with David Grann, one of the things that he said is that really anybody who looks into this era of terrible era of Oklahoma history, everybody has the same amount of information.
Right. It's
Right?
the same.
It's
the same stuff.
It's the same stuff. The only thing that's going to change is if people open up and start talking about it through their oral histories. And that's one of the ways that you found out about some of the stuff, like how your mother ended up being out of
Right.
her grandmother and A.T. Woodward's house.
Right. But there are some, there are some things being done. So for example, now it may not be writing, who knows what the next step is going to be, but already there are two, let me find it here. There are two, there's CNN. So there are two documentaries coming out, and the
Okay.
documentaries they're interviews with Osages who haven't, who are not connected with the Reign of Terror, the FBI files. In other
Okay.
words, Osages are beginning to tell on tape their stories, what happened to their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers. So that's something that's going to happen. And then the other thing, there's a move afoot by my cousin, Joe and his wife, Carol, to try to establish a museum, a Reign of Terror museum at the Tall Chief Theater in Fairfax. So that could be another way of telling the story.
Yeah. Okay.
So we have to get more information about their. So in other words, right now there have been two books from outsiders, David Grann and myself. Although I'm Osage, I was an outsider, using the same sources. Okay, there's got to be. My hope is that Osages now will start telling, Osages there will start telling their family stories and keep telling these stories until we get a better sense of what happened.
Yeah, I think
because the killers were not just William Hale and Burkhart.
right.
The killers were the lawyers and the doctors and
the whole
everybody.
section about what doctors did with
The bankers?
pregnant Osage is just
Mhm.
absolutely horrible,
Right.
horrifying.
Right.
And
There were forced sterilizations by doctors.
yeah, it's horrible. There's a couple other questions here
Yes.
that I want to get to. I'm going to leave this one that's really hard to the end. But somebody asked the question, was Sybil's stepfather guardian to any other Osage who died under
Yes,
mysterious
4.
circumstances?
It's a 4, I think it was 3 or 4, and they all died before.
There's 6. In
There
your
were
book, 6. Yes.
Oh, okay. But
I
3
just
or 4
quoted
of
you.
whom had died.
Yes.
And then you met somebody when you did the play.
Yes. Who
Came up and said A.T. Woodward was my grandmother's guardian, and he stole a ranch in Montana from her.
Yeah, exactly. So, and of course, he is one of the people who had a headright.
Yes,
he got the headright from
yes, from my great grandmother, and then in a life's estate. In other words, at his death, it was supposed to then revert to heirs of Sybil, but he managed to break it.
Yeah,
so he broke that life's estate, and he gave it to. I think after my great grandmother died, he married a bank teller, and she ended up with multiple headrights.
Yeah, and that's the joy of being married to a lawyer, I guess, being able to break those things.
That's right.
I'm sorry, this is and the people who are watching do not know that this reading this book, every time I read this book, I cry because of the terrible things that happened to it.
There's a lot in there,
Yeah, well, right. I want to make sure. I'm
So
looking to
someone
make
had
sure.
someone had a question about, she wanted to find out about, her grandfather was a guardian.
Oh,
And
yes.
she wanted to
yes.
find out how she could find more information about him, because she's
Yeah.
upset that he might have, he was a guardian. And my answer to her is, if you want to investigate any members of your ancestors, that, especially about the guardians, that information is at the archives in Fort Worth. And
Yeah.
so each of those guardians has a file. So this is kind of some of the stuff that can happen for more investigation. Somebody can go through there and match those names up with who died, who inherited the land, so on and so forth. And also, if you, and one thing I like to say, if you do start an investigation into your grandfather or your grandmother, like I did, whether it's a guardian or a victim, don't take it personally. In other words, if you find out your grandfather was a bad guy, he's not you. And the fact that
Right.
you're trying to learn something about your family history and where it all fits and what role your family may have had, it doesn't mean that you're bad. It just means that you know.
Yeah, exactly. A couple other things that just I am. There's a couple of other questions here, like why were guardians assigned to Osage and
Because Osages were making so much money that Congress thought it was awful that they were actually spending money and enjoying themselves. So they devised a system to appoint guardians to put them on allowances, basically.
and declared every single Osage incompetent.
Incompetent.
Yeah, it's
Right.
terrible, terrible. So I think that that's an important thing. I'm just double checking because I have about 5 different places.
Yeah.
You have traveled around a bit, and we're over time. It's about 10 after 8, and so here in the land of the free and the home of the brave, where you are, it's a little later. You've traveled around. You've been, obviously, you are the son of military. You're a military brat. Yes,
I'm an
there we
army
go. I
brat.
was trying to get the correct phrase. So you've been all over the place, and you even talked about going to Montana and being in Baltimore. And are you settling down yet?
No, I'm still a vagabond. I'm now in Raleigh, grandkids. Okay, that's the
North
short
Carolina.
answer. And we now have a house in Fairfax, Oklahoma, which actually was, as irony of ironies, this was a former bookstore where I had a book signing with my mother in this
Yes.
house.
Yeah.
In fact, where the table was with the books, that's now our living room. Okay, and it was vacant for many years and no longer a bookstore. So we have renovated it, and it also is a block or two away from my cousin, Joe and Carol Connor. We bought it from another cousin who actually bought it to tear it down, but you couldn't find anybody to tear it down. And so we're, again, it's also part of my quest in retirement. I'm not retired yet. I'm scared to death, honestly, to be retired, because the last time I had a lot of free time on my hands when I was doing the book, some bad things happened.
Yeah.
But that was 10,000 days ago. So,
Can I say something? This is something that I think that folks should know. And I want to, you can comment on it, and you can say, you told this to me. The detective story that you tell in this book, you would think that the detective is the hero. And you have told me that the detective, which is you, is not the hero.
Right.
who actually ultimately was not the person who went and found some of the final pieces of the puzzle.
Right. But that's why I also decided to write the detective story, because in addition to all these other things, it allowed me to make the good guy in the story my mother. It was my mother. So I crashed and burned finally, little too much drinking.
A
The
little.
drinking sort of stood for, gee, what happens to you when you live a lie and when you start confronting a lie? So it's not that we all become alcoholics, but it was an allegory for crashing and burning. This realization of the new you and the truth is pretty painful. Okay. So in the book, I was unable to make the trip I had to make to the Fort Worth archives to look in those Guardian files and look in Sybil's files. And so my mother said, I'll go. And so she went. So my mother actually ended up solving the mystery of how Sybil died and who killed her by doing that. So the drinking was also a way. So in a detective story, all the detective stories, you have to confront something. You have a challenge. There's a bad guy who's beating you up. You're in a car chase, so and so. Couldn't have those. William Hale couldn't arrange to have me, beat up or chase me across the reservation, shooting at me. My challenge was overcoming my drinking. And that also allowed me to tell the truth, because ultimately this is a story about telling the truth. This is a story about all of the lies of the Reign of Terror, the lies of my mother surrounding Sybil. So I couldn't very well write a story about telling the truth and not tell the truth. And the truth was, my mother solved the mystery, and she was the hero of the story.
Somebody asked the question that this is where the first time I cried when I was researching. I did my own research, went to Pawhuska, went to the Catholic Church there, went inside. I've been there since then. After the production of it, I just sort of wandered around Pawhuska because this is a story, I think, that haunts me. I think it should haunt all of America. But going into the Catholic Church there's a couple interesting things about that church and its stained glass windows. Number one, it took papal dispensation or whatever it is to put the great big huge stained glass window back in the nave, I think is where it is, of everybody, including the French
Real
priest.
people.
And last time I was in there, somebody gave me a tour of it and said, and that's so and so and so and so and so and so.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my grandmother. Yeah,
cool.
And they put living people
Right.
in that, I think.
Right.
But
and
if
my
you go into
grandmother's in there.
What?
And my grandmother is in
Yes,
there.
you go into the to the church and you go to the right, and the first stained glass window over there is dedicated to Sybil Bolton.
Right.
And it's given to the church by Kathleen Connor, right? Kathleen Connor and
A.T. Woodward. And Sybil's sister.
Yes, Gorman, and Andrea Gorman, the opera singer.
Right.
We are over time. I had jokingly said that we would not be talking more than an hour.
We always do.
We always talk more than an hour. So I thank everybody who has listened to us gab about this, not just gab, but talk about the important things that are in it. It is a pleasure to share this book with anybody who wants to do it. So I love this book. It's on my list of books that I will reread.
Well, thank you.
So if there is nothing else, then what I'm going to do is say thanks again. My understanding is that we are going to sign off.
Okay. Hey,
Yes.
thank you, everybody.
Yes.
Thank
So
you.
thank you, Denny, for coming back 26 years later.
I know it's tough. You know, I have not talked publicly about this book this century. So this is a first. Anyway,
Someone
thank
asked-
you very much. Oh,
Someone asked the question or made the comment and the question, this would make a great movie. Have you got any offers? And I can answer that. I'm the only one who
Right.
said, can I make this into
Right.
a play?
and you know what? It works on stage because on stage you can go back and forth in time.
Yeah.
In movies, those kind of movies aren't really any good.
Yeah, it is hard. to do
I
that.
mean, those, where you're investigating the past and you're going back and forth, past and present, past and present. But on the
Right.
stage, you made it work.
Well, I made it work because I had good material. So.
Well, thanks. Listen, thank you,
It didn't make you
everybody.
any richer, though. I will tell you that. Not
no,
any richer.
It didn't me. I'm still working. Hey.
Yeah, I'm going to be working all the way up until I can't write anymore.
Of course, if I had made millions from this book, like the book that we affectionately call Brand X in my house, I'd have blown it. I'd have blown that. I'd have gone right through that. So my reward for writing this book was finding family that I didn't know I had, and that those friendships have lasted a lot longer than those millions would have lasted.
And I guess there's one last person that I think that we should acknowledge before we go, and that is the person, the people who stood by your side through all of this. Your lovely wife, Fleur.
Yes, absolutely. My son, the baby in the book, is now his 30th birthday is next week.
Yeah. Oops.
And he's a great writer. He really is.
Good.
As good as his grandmother.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to reading his stuff too.
Good.
We're going to go. We're saying goodbye.
I hope they do a good job on the movie, and there are lots of Osages in the movie, and let's hope that they do a good job. Let's hope they do it justice.
Okay. Thanks again, Denny. I'm going to close this down.
Click it off. Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to Magic City Books.
Yes, thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.